Do you ever feel like you're getting the best of your team? And do you ever feel that if your team was able to handle stress a little bit better, that they'd be far more productive? And how would your company fare if your best employee leaves all of a sudden? We're going to be covering this and so much more on this episode of All Things Locks. So Dan, last week we talked about burnout, how that's such a massive contributor to success, to mindset. Probably the best place to start is let's talk a little bit about resiliency, and what is your definition of that?
Ooh, my definition. Well, I mean, overall, when I think of resiliency, and that is a common term you hear nowadays of just, you have to have employees that are resilient. And then I'm sure many of us are out there saying, that's great. What does that actually mean?
What does all that mean?
You know, and ultimately, the common terminology really is more about dealing with setbacks and failures. But, you know, for me, the way I like to approach it is also just knowing how to adapt, how to grow in the face of just challenges. So it's not a matter of I have to fail to be resilient. It's what's just happening when we're being pushed and driven and challenged, which really happens almost every damn day. So that's the way I look at it. But ultimately, it's really being about proactive versus being reactive. And that's what actually is going to create somebody who is very resilient and is going to be able to grow and develop.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because when I look at being resilient too, that when we're being proactive, it's also anticipating. So if I'm proactive against a stressor or something that's going to knock me over, knock a business over, how you showcase or demonstrate that resiliency is the ability to withstand that force. But part of it in being proactive is anticipating that happening. It's almost like, if you're in a boxing match and it's like, anticipating the punch that's coming. On the reactive side of things is like, well, everyone's been in that situation where we get blindsided by something, business, life, there's a divorce, there's a car accident. My wife got in a car accident a couple months ago. And it's like, it's not something that you're prepared for. It just happens. So when those things occur in life, because they will happen, how do you deal with them with grace? How do you deal with them where you're not losing your head, but you get hit, but then you get right back and you're still marching forward?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about how to kind of prepare for the worst, right? You hope for the best, plan for the worst. COVID was a great example of that. You can't always be prepped for everything, but you can kind of situate yourself in a way that allows you to rebound rather quickly and in some instances really thrive. But the other aspect that I look at with resiliency that you see in business a lot is the ability to work on something for quite a while. Maybe it's a project, or maybe it's an employee that you hired and it's not working out. And the stubborn person tries to make it work. And it's just how much time and resources are dedicated towards something that it's not maybe a lost cause, but it's like, all right, maybe the market shifted and this isn't what's calling for it, or maybe this was just a bad hire. Like there was a CEO I had back in the day, and he hired a super nice guy. It just wasn't a great fit for the position. And he was there for longer than he should have been. And we're having a meeting one day, and he finally got to the point, he's like, all right, I think we should just get rid of the guy. And I'm like, not thank God that we were firing him, but like it wasn't a good fit. And the guy was getting pissed off because he knew he wasn't a good fit. I was like, oh, thank God. And then like 2 seconds later, the CEO was like, you know what, fuck this. We're going to make it work. And I was like, dude, you're missing the whole point. And this is what I'm talking about with resiliency, is to not let your ego get in the way of trying to make something work. Maybe it's a relationship. I think, unfortunately, we've all probably been in that situation. It's like, I've dedicated 2 years of my life to this. I'm going to make this work. Instead of just what lessons can be learned from the relationship or the situation or the project, whatever it may be, and then just kind of wash your hands of it and say, how do we make it better going forward?
100%. And so there's definitely two different versions of this. There's like there is the individual and how they demonstrate resilience.
Yeah.
And then a team. What would be some characteristics or defining like a team, like in a team context? What is that? And then also, why does that matter? Making sure your team has resilience.
Yeah, so I would say the first thing you talked about, just the organization, really the leadership team has to be the most resilient, right? So it's very hard to say to your team, hey guys, we gotta be more resilient. And then at the smallest sign of stress, you see leadership chaotic, not having a plan, mixed messaging. It just really creates a big trickle down effect that more or less kind of defeats any message you might have given the staff. But ultimately, you want to see team members that feel like they're in an environment where they can actually just speak up and share ideas. Now, if you want to call that psychological safety, it's basically creating an environment where employees feel, hey, this is a good environment for me I can go up to Antonio and give him an idea without being, worried that he's going to yell at me or tell me it's a stupid, idiotic idea. And that kind of,
yeah, that happens too.
Yeah, like it does happen.
That was the dumbest piece of advice I ever heard in my life, but it's like, it's worth it.
You get completely shot down, and it's just, why would I then bring anything to the table? So you really end up creating a lack of innovation amongst your own employees. So really looking at psychological safety, strong communication is really going to be an important one. How well does your team collaborate is a big one as well. And then, when we're looking at difficult times and maybe some stressors, we tend to talk in business about, does your company or employees have values that align? Like, are they working towards the same goal? So basically meaning, is there something that's driving them forward when times are tough? Do they understand, hey, this is what we're actually working towards? And if you're it's customers, or if you're in a healthcare setting, we're doing this for the patients, right? And that's what's going to keep us moving. So I look at things like that as just overall communication, the ability to share ideas, the ability to have really shared values that are moving them in the right direction.
So a resilient team, from what you're saying, is like they're very adaptable. They can recover really well. They're able to grow collectively as a unit in the face of these challenges. And just at the end of the day, they're proactive, they're collaborative, and they're very solution oriented.
Yeah,
like that. At the end of the day, it's definitely that. And I guess some of the reasons why it would matter is when you have a unit like that, the byproduct is the turnover rate in the organization is actually smaller, right? So kind of what you mentioned, if there's a stressor or something happens and it's the tiniest thing in the whole wide world, people are not losing their head. They're staying in the pocket because there's a purpose to the work and a reason behind it of why you need to stay focused. And then also it's kind of the standard of the proximity. If everyone else is cool as a cucumber, it's like doing a mission and all of your mission buddies in this like military operation are like, they're all James Bond. And it's like, everyone's cool and calm and collected. It's like, you can't help but have that rub off on you. So when your culture is like that, then any new person that comes in or anything like that, they're acclimating to the psychology of the team. It's very, very interesting.
Yeah, you nailed it. I was actually gonna add one thing to that. So if you're, people all right, what does a lack of resilience look like, right? Because again, maybe you are not the most resilient person. And it is a little hard to identify the characteristics maybe that we're missing. But I kind of chuckle, like I've been in healthcare for a long time, and the best example I would say for that is you have a medical provider who's got a fairly wide open schedule, and then a new patient calls up. Maybe you call to make an appointment for that day, and then the front desk tells them, hey, you got a new patient coming at this time, and they just like freak out. And it's because, I had my whole schedule laid out, and I was going to use that time for this, to do my notes or whatever, and now it's all screwed up. And I'd always kind of like scratch my head, like, what is the problem here? Like, you got the time, number one, you didn't get jammed in at a time where you have like 4 or 5 other patients. You're here to serve the patient. Now you got a patient coming in, and you're like kind of fucking complaining about it because it ruins your whole scheduled day. And that's part of it too. Is like, last week when we were talking about burnout and how to be adaptable, and we're talking about how to be resilient here, it's knowing how to be flexible, so to speak. And this is, I find that and I'm just kind of curious to know what you think on this, not just business owners, but people in general, that we've become so freaking rigid and like wanting to control everything, that I need to know exactly what's going to happen minute by minute. And if something throws that off, then it's just like my whole day's ruined or something like that. So that's like, I've seen that, and I'm like, it just boggles my mind. I'm kind of curious to know what you've seen working with organizations as well.
So when it comes to that, when someone has their whole day scheduled out, everything is planned out down to a T, and then it shifts and they can adapt with it, it's probably a couple things. One is that individual is wired that way. They can handle that. They're okay with that. In predictive index, they would say that person has a high flexibility score for the most part. So if anything happens, they're not hyper rigid, and they won't lose their marbles. They're not like super OCD. If you imagine an OCD person, you move one thing, they just lose it. Yep. They're kind of on the other end of that spectrum. So their temperament is that they can actually take that and they're okay. So that's one side. You can have people that are on the other end of that spectrum. However, the expectation is clear. It's like, so if there's an expectation of my schedule is booked out, everything is down to a T, whatever it is, and something happens, well, if I have the expectation as like things happen in healthcare, things happen in this business. I mean, just look at what's going on, right now in the world where like, explosions are happening, things are happening, and CEOs are moving and pivoting. It's like, well, that's kind of the nature of the business. And even though that I have a high preference to be rigid and to have a clean step-by-step schedule, if I tell you like, look, you're the doctor here. If something comes in and it's urgent, whatever, you have to take that and you have to have the grace to adjust to it. So I think it's setting up those expectations very, very clear and having that be the first thing. And that has to be founded in purpose.
Yeah. So you mentioned grace, and I look at that almost as still being, I kind of link that with gratitude, right? In the sense of still looking at what you have available to you that is really good. Instead of looking at a situation like you noted with like a walk-in patient of, all right, now this throws off my whole day versus I get to help somebody, or maybe you're in a customer service business. It's like, I get to actually help somebody have potentially an amazing day. Mm-hmm. That's not to be taken for granted, which I find that's just something that we tend to do as a society. We're always looking for like what's wrong, what's being taken away from me versus what do I actually have that's really amazing. Then maybe I forgot a little bit.
I think so too. I think when it comes to grace, I look at it from a place of like forgiveness of you have outlined the perfect week, the perfect schedule. Things happen, things move all over the place. It could be because of a mistake of an employee. It could be because someone miscommunicated something with a patient or with a prospect, or maybe a prospect or an account that you want to close moved up a timeline or delayed a timeline, so now it's impeding onto your calendar. That's where the forgiveness happens, where you have to dangle this thing that the goal, the purpose of the business, whatever it is that I have to make some adjustments in order to win here. And even though that throws off my structure, and how you're going to demonstrate resiliency is by first giving it the frame of like, I forgive that person. It was an issue or something happened. Because I think if you get angry at that, which is really easy for people to do, they get pissed. Like, what the fuck is up with this meeting? Like, who scheduled this? And what? It's like really easy to do that. That doesn't help anything. If you need those outbursts and you're in an industry or you're in a situation where like that happens every now and then, that happens in commercial fishing, it happens in oil, it happens in Hollywood, whatever, right? I'm not saying that that's a great thing to do, but I'm saying get back into that space of like, cool, we got a job to do. Let's work around it and do the best we can. And that's an expectations thing. And that's like, you kind of have to forgive and move on. You can't be dwelling on that. You have a job to do.
Yeah. So now you mentioned, some of the benefits you talked about, reducing turnover, employees having a better morale, increased ability to navigate through crisis, and just overall being able to drive innovation and have higher productivity. Where, or maybe not where, but how would an organization then, if they say, hey, look, we want to actually start looking at this and start addressing what we think might be a lack of adaptability or resiliency, how would they actually start to see, all right, is this an issue for us? Like, how do we know that this is something that we need to actually work on?
Yeah, so a couple of areas. So this is where it's really important to have your operations locked in, where you're able to identify KPIs within the whole company, basically the numbers of the company. There's that saying, numbers don't lie. So numbers don't lie around performance. And there's always going to be a story to tell with your company, whether your business is seasonal. Right. So we live in Vegas. It can be a little bit seasonal here, just like in Wisconsin, a roofing company could be seasonal out there during the winter. So however the numbers are squeezed or pressed, it's a reflection typically of productivity of an individual, whether they're in accounting, whether they're in sales, whether they're in marketing, whatever else. So resilience is usually in reference to a force that's coming at us. We are resilient towards that thing. Like if I'm insulin resistant, resilience, right? We're kind of pushing against something. And when we're trying to identify what that looks like with individuals or departments, it's seeing like, all right, we took on, a certain amount of accounts that we're not usually expecting. How did our departments handle it? Where were the bottlenecks? Where were the communication gaps? And then based off of that, you're able to look at the individuals off of the department. Then you can look at like your sales manager, like what happened here. You can look at your marketing manager, your CFO, like, hey, what happened here? And you're able to ask those questions as far as like, tell me about your decision-making process. What was the judgment like? What happened here? And you're trying to identify as a business owner where they've just fucking rattled because all the shit was happening that was outside of the norm. Did you lose an account or a couple accounts and then like now you got rattled? Did you gain a lot of accounts and you got rattled? So you're looking at that from like an operational perspective. I do recommend businesses do some kind of behavioral assessment for the organization. That is clear, hard data. Predictive index is really good. DISC can also give you some really good stuff too. So you're able to look at the wiring and the temperament of the people that you have, but you're never really going to know this until something happens to the company.
So just to like interrupt for a quick second, you're talking kind of like almost like a personality.
Like a personality test. Yeah.
Test, okay.
Yeah. So taking a personality test. So a predictive index is one. DISC is another one. Because if you imagine your employees as like breeds of dogs,
which we're not calling them dogs.
Yeah, we're not calling them dogs. Like, but it's like a really good example because it's like the stuff you would have a German Shepherd do and the stress that a German Shepherd, what we've seen they can handle, is not what you put a poodle through. But a poodle could be really good here, which would not be good for a German Shepherd. Us as people, like it's really hard to identify that just from the outside looking in. You really can't. You have to do behavioral assessment tests, and you have to ask really great questions in your vetting process, your interviews. Like when you're interviewing them and putting them through that process. That's going to give you indicators of whether or not they have that, if they're made out of that right stuff, that they can handle tough times in your company as you're scaling, as you're growing, as you're doing whatever.
So I was going to ask you towards the end, but you brought it up, so it's a great time to ask you. What would be some great questions? Because I find that talking to people about an interview process, right? So let's just get this out of the way. You're never hitting 10 out of 10 on your interviews. So if your goal is, I got to hire every person and they're going to stay for, you're just setting yourself up for failure. But your success rate should get better and better and better if you do have the mindset of learning from each interview that you do. What could I have done differently, or what could I have asked that would have been a better, more high level question? So when it comes to identifying traits, because I know that's something that I've spent a lot more time on over the last few years, and that is skyrocketed my success rate of really great hires who stay for a long time too. What would be some questions that you might ask if I was interviewing you, that you might ask me to identify, is Dan resilient or is he going to really struggle here?
Cool. So resilience is a combination of things, right? So you kind of mentioned that, resilience is able to withstand an opposing force. It's being flexible. It could be rigid, right? There's a handful of things that's that. But the issue with that is when you're asking somebody about resiliency, it can be quite subjective. It's like, tell me when you were resilient, or tell me when you were integrous. It's like, right. It's hard to kind of answer that at times. So what I recommend with business owners is when you're trying to isolate a story or a characteristic, basically you're trying to find like, are they mentally tough? So some questions you can ask them is quite simply like, tell me, there's this one acronym called TED. I saw it someplace, it was really good. Tell me, explain, and describe. So tell me of a time that you had a really difficult situation at work where you felt like the sky is falling, you're about to quit. Tell me about that situation and how you overcame that and what was going through your mind. I'm trying to pick up on vernacular on this one, like what's going on. Other really good questions you can have to find out resiliency is, before I get into like maybe some of those questions, please consider the role that you're hiring them for, right? And I would also set up questions so they could be truthful, especially around integrity and about lying. And so when you get into the mindset stuff, that people are framed just to be a little bit more truthful. Everyone wants to sound tough. This is very similar if you watch like TV shows like Hard Knocks, for example, where you have general managers vetting NFL players,
Sure.
right? They're really good at kind of picking apart of reading in between the lines. So when you're asking them questions as far as like, tell me a time where, you were left alone on a job and you just had to kind of dig deep and get things done. What was going through your mind? Tell me other times in life where you wanted to quit and you persevered, whether personally or professionally. And also tell me about, or explain to me specifically what goes through your mind when you're dealing with a dire situation. You need to create a solution for yourself and your team. How do you communicate that? And give me an example of that, of how you communicate that. Those little things I think are really helpful because I'm actually just trying to see if they're being truthful or untruthful. All of the questions before that in the interview is for you to determine what their body language is like when they're saying something truthful versus off, especially when you're dealing with mindset.
Damn, that was very high level. So there you go. So we do have your ways, because I know that's going to be one of the common concerns is just how to identify these people, or if you've now maybe taken the proactive steps to look at your own team and figure out, all right, who's got it, who needs the work, and then start to come up with some actionable strategies that we're going to get into. But then it's also, all right, now how do I identify that going forward? So, I really like that. It is really just being able to, whether it's resiliency or like you brought up being integrity, whatever the way I look at it is whatever is important to you in your job, in your business. Is it resiliency, adaptability, hard work, honesty? Come up with questions that, to Antonio's point, that somebody has a story around because it's something that they've actually encountered. And that's really how you're going to identify people. It's just, honestly, it's like any social interaction, right? It's like, how do I learn about people? Like, just ask them good questions. Like, it's like the introvert's worst nightmare. It's like, how do I talk to people? It's like, you just got to ask questions and ask really good, purposeful questions, and people open their heart pretty quickly. So I love that you said that. So now we talked about getting people into your company. Now, what about the team that we have? All right. So, like, what are some actionable strategies that we can do to actually start increasing the resilience in our teams?
I actually love this one. I think making sure that you're speaking from the heavens on what the core values are of the company, and making sure that, especially if you're in an industry where it can be really volatile, where things are constantly shifting and the people just need to be able to pivot and maneuver and negotiate through that, making sure that kind of one of the things that we talked about is making sure our communication is on point, our communication is consistent, our communication is fast, and that there's clear expectations. If I tell you, if you're going to be driving to a certain city and I tell you nothing, and there's like major potholes, there's like barbed wire fence, it's gravel roads, it's messed up. Well, you going into that versus me telling you that, like, hey, if you take this road, this is what's going to expect, but hey, you'll still get there. Now that you have that expectation, the human mind is desired to overcome anyway. So having that is really, really key. And then going back to the core values is that when you're setting an expectation of what's to come, but also an expectation of how to behave. And that's a core value thing. Again, sports teams, law enforcement, see it in military, you see it in very high level companies where they are talking about adaptability, versatility, work ethic. They're talking about positivity, that no matter what happens today, there's a way to win. So dig deep. If you need a coffee break, if you need to recharge, there's stuff here. That constant communication is really, really good. And I think that paired with what it takes to win here, which is around the core values, I think that's what transforms teams. That's what, when you get like average players on another like football team and they go to another organization and they just end up killing it. Yep. It's usually that. It's same thing with a business. You have a kind of B player someplace else, they go to the right organization, and that clear, effective communication you end up getting a great, awesome player. Yeah.
So definitely establishing the culture. And like we talked about at the beginning of the episode, that starts with the leadership team. So what is the culture? It's one that we want to have as continuous learning, not being afraid to make mistakes is a big one for sure, right? And then what are the values and goals that are going to help move everybody in the same direction? I know for me, outside of just learning about team members and identifying their strengths and weaknesses so they can help each other, right? And you talked about German Shepherds versus Poodles, like different strengths, all right? Yeah. So some people are going to have natural problem-solving skills that other people do not. And I know part of the challenge for a leader. It's not even just, hey, here's the leadership team. It's like, all right, I'm a manager and I have a team and I don't really, I'm handling a lot of things. It's being able to also leverage team members that can help each other and help you, right? So I'm terrible at problem solving and I'm an entry-level employee. You're my fellow colleague and you're amazing at it. It would be a good idea to maybe pair us together or have us work together in some capacity. So it's not just, all right, well, I'm the manager and I got to help Dan and I got to do my own stuff and then I got to help this team member and I just don't have enough time.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. I want to flip that back over to you here in a second, but what you're essentially describing is communication channels. That when you're able to identify the strengths and weaknesses of an employee or an individual in your organization of like this stuff you want to give Frank, because Frank will nail it, knock it out, 10 out of 10, amazing work. Don't give him this stuff because it'll fall flat. So when you illuminate a negative, you highlight a positive. It's like one of my favorite sayings. I'm finding out that this is a good thing and this is a negative thing. So now it allows us as leadership to be like, all right, who's the person that can complement that? And now we're talking about delegation. And now we're talking about communication channels. So what I am doing with this person, what I'm not doing with this person. And what I'm not doing with this person, I'm giving to someone else that does it really, really well.
Yeah.
And what that does is, going back to what you're saying, as far as strong communication, clear, open, honest dialogue. Well, you can have that clear, open, honest dialogue with the wrong person. And that creates communication bottlenecks in your company. So just doing that alone is going to help. But I want to flip it back over to you about the importance of making sure you're having soft skills with that as a leader, where you're able to have that clear, assertive messaging of what we need to do, but then also expanding on your vocabulary, on your repertoire over here to make sure that you also have some of these soft skills for everyone else. You're not alienating anybody.
No, I mean, there's definitely a level of, you can be that strong-willed leader who's very kind, right? And it's kind of like, what is that? Speak softly and carry a big stick, so to speak. But it's like, you don't have to be the loudest voice.
And we're back. Okay.
Nah, you don't have to be the loudest voice in a room. Because that's definitely, if that's your impression of what leadership should be, then you're sadly mistaken. It's just how to set standards, and that's really what I find where a lot of people, struggle with is like, do I need to be very dominant? And do I need to micromanage? And if you just know how to communicate to people in a way that is holding them accountable, and, you have to start with yourself. And I know for me in the past, that was my mistake, was I wanted to hold everybody else accountable for their actions. And then I didn't really do that for myself. So it's, you're trying to create some kind of culture, and you can see why it would be somewhat shitty. So you have to start with yourself as a leader, take accountability, be responsible, be resilient. And, I have to understand too, is it's not just a matter of, like you said, doing a predictive index or a DISC to help you understand people. But once you actually can step out from focusing on yourself and really start looking at the team, because, it kind of goes back to that question of how to identify if my employees are not the most resilient. It's like, do you ever just connect with them? Do you talk to them? Do you sincerely just like maybe watch them in action and get out of your own head and stop looking at everything through your own lens of like, I'm resilient. Well, that's you. Some of us have,
and it's a perspective of whether
like,
you think so as well.
Yeah, 100%. And some of us, and that's the thing that really takes people to the next level is when they realize I'm great at this, but that's just me.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else is not great at this. So how do I now teach them these skills? Because we're not the same. We're not robots. We weren't made in a factory. We're all very different. Beliefs drive our actions. Our motivating factors drive our actions. So it's like we have all that in place, but then we expect everybody to just be like us. And I hate that when owners do that. It's like, well, I'm like this. Why aren't they? Then I'm fucking you. You have to train them. And this is actually an area that really kind of pisses me off, is when companies want to complain about what employees are lacking, and then they don't want to do anything to actually improve it. It's just they want to bitch and moan about it and complain. Like, they're still terrible at it. It's like, well, what'd you do to help fix it?
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, I yelled at them. Doesn't that change it? It's like, dude, you have to work on their skills. And that would probably take me to this last aspect of strategies to help build teams, is actually work on the skills that they're lacking and train them on it. And, like for me, I think the best example, and I talked to a lot of people that I, like in my past company, that I talked to them about this, that we would have a call center that would just, hey, I got a new patient for you, and it's at 5 o'clock, and I know you got like 4 other patients coming in right at that same time, but here's a brand new patient who's really fucked up. Good luck. And I know when I was younger and I was immature and I didn't know how to articulate and kind of work around that, easy solution would be, well, fix the call center, but it's just challenges that we had. But I wouldn't tell them about that. And then the situation would occur. It wouldn't be handled the best way. And then obviously they get pissed and frustrated. And at some point it's like, all right, I got to like, A, just be honest about what's going to happen. And then B, I got to prepare them for it. And I started doing like role playing. I was like, all right, this is what happens. What would you do? What are you thinking? What are you going to do with that patient? And like we started working through the scenario. And then ultimately, unfortunately, it played out in real life. And I'd go to them like, how did you do? And they're like, it was actually pretty easy. Mm-hmm. And then I know past employees like, man, I wish you did that with me. I was like, I know, I didn't think about it at that point. Like about training for the scenarios that we're going to encounter. And I find out if just companies did that, like these are the worst things that happen here. Some of it we can't control, but we can control how you respond to it. And that goes back to like, as we're talking about this whole episode of resilience, it's just how do we respond to the situations? Well, instead of hiding from it, just be honest with your employees. This is our wrinkles. These are our warts. Here's what we're going to do to counteract it.
Do you recommend having monthly like team check-ins or individual check-ins?
I mean, I'm a big fan of just, if it's possible, I do dailies. If you got a massive team, which obviously makes it very hard to manage. I mean, I don't care what anybody says. Like effectively, you can manage like 6 to 8 people. So if you're like, I can manage 50 people, it's like you can't.
What do you use? Did you use like a system like Slack, Discord?
No, I mean,
I was
in a setting where I had the ability to do it face to face. If I was spread out, 100%. I mean, look, a check-in via Slack or even a text message is better than no check-in. Mm-hmm. And if you can't do it daily, if you're like, all right, Dan, you're out of your mind, dude, do it weekly at least. You know, and ultimately it's not a matter of just, hey, we doing okay work-wise. You ultimately, ideally want to make it known that you legitimately care about the employees as people. You know, and when we're trying to build resilient people, that usually occurs when they know, hey, at least I know this company has my back. That if I can't respond appropriately, they'll be there to support me. So I would say weekly the most. Month, you're missing so much happens in a month. Yeah, that you're just playing behind them. You know,
what kind of questions do you want them to give you feedback on? Where like, so if let's just say a company can't do daily, it's just like, well, I just can't do it. But like a weekly check-in. Tell me the positives, negatives, and the wins or whatever the week. Well, what are some of the things that you're looking for so you can read in between the lines and figure out, we might need to have a one-on-one with this person or with that department. What do you look for?
No, I mean, I think the biggest thing that you said is I always love, as often as possible, I love starting a conversation with just what's going well, what are some wins? Because it's very easy for us just to always focus on the negative. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I ask somebody like, so what's going on in life? First thing I do, let me tell you, it's like, all right, how about I rephrase that and say, what's going well? Or what are some wins that you've had? Small or large, right? Because I know we focus on the big wins, which is like, I got a house, or I'm getting married, I'm having a kid. It's like, all right, that only happens like very rare. Mm-hmm. So what's going on day to day that's working really well for you? But one of the things I like to do is just, what are the challenges that we're having? You know, what could I do to make your life easier? You know, what could I provide to you as the person in charge or the leadership position? What could I do to make your life easier? Because it's not always a matter of like, hey, there's bottlenecks like you mentioned, or there's all crap. It's just, can we make things that are really good even better?
Yeah, that's one of the questions I like asking them, because I think sometimes in asking somebody like, hey, what can I do to make your life easier? What can I do to make your role simpler? Sometimes people can look at that as like, you're isolating me. Versus tell me what we can sharpen in our systems to make, the role easier. So almost like formatting those questions in a way where it's not about the individual, it's about the thing. And it's crazy the answers that I'll get from something like that. Like, what within our company can be sharper to make this particular role that much better? And they're like, probably this and this integration with that. And it's like, but ask them like, what can I do for you to make your life easier? Like, I don't know, give me a fucking raise. How's that sound? It's like, okay, maybe not that, but, or maybe something else.
But it's more about like the day to day.
Exactly.
That's the thing. It's not a matter of like, I could use like an extra $40,000. It's like, all right, what could I do day to day to make what you're doing here more efficient or make it a little bit less stressful?
Yeah.
And maybe it's nothing, but
And when you're seeing patterns like that, when you roll it into kind of the monthly, one of the things that is helpful is, hey, based off these last 4 weeks, you mentioned X. I'd like to give you a task, take 10 minutes of Monday and find out what could be a reasonable solution to this. So now that employee is responsible at looking at different software, different solutions, different ways of improving the thing that they don't like, and actually giving, one sheet plan of like, I like this for this reason. I like that for that reason. I like this for here. And if you want to make this easier, quicker, faster, more effective, and better for me, it's probably these 3 things. And it's something that they particularly vetted. And if it's something that you roll with, the buy-in is a lot higher because they're the ones that actually brought it to you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like that. And I think that really helps with the resilience front, on the resilience front, because ultimately we're just trying to understand the psychology of the person and the psychology of the team. Like, where are they really? And if we can reduce that guard, it's hard sometimes when you're in leadership and you're trying to really understand where someone's coming from, and you know that there's a guard because we know that the relationship is I can fire you at any second and they need the money. It's an interesting dynamic. So anything that we can do on this front to lower that, so there's open and good communication to understand the true psychology, to actually understand whether that person is, made of that right stuff or that mindset is there. And then that allows us to workshop, allows us to have those one-on-ones and have them to be more fruitful. Yeah.
And the other thing too is to also just acknowledge when team members are demonstrating what you want to see. So you see a team member who is very resilient, naturally gifted. They just, they're very flexible. They're easygoing. They're like, I just take things as they come and it is what it is. And it's being able to then still acknowledge them, because then what you want to do is, if we're trying to create the culture or reinforce the culture that this is what we do, the best way to do it, especially as you're bringing in new people, is to just acknowledge the ones that are already doing it. And it just kind of makes me chuckle / get frustrated when somebody's like, why am I, demonstrating some gratitude for them to just do what they're supposed to be doing? Yeah. But then I'm like, well, okay, that's fine. But then how many employees do you complain about that don't do what they should be doing, where they're not resilient and they fall apart with the smallest little stress, or they react in a way not like this person? Yeah. So why not say, hey, great job doing that? Or like, great way to be resilient, great way to handle that situation, to reinforce it. Yeah. So that other people will start to pick up on, hey, if I do that, I'll get some acknowledgement as well. And as human beings, we all like that.
Yeah. It's also playing the numbers. It's also playing the percentages. You are going to have some people that really love that recognition. It's a need for them. And then there's others that that's not the case. So if you widen that a little bit, you're able to capture a bigger net of all your employees, of the things that that they need to hear and see and feel, so they have that fulfillment, kind of that little check mark, or that box checked. And I think when, as a leader, you expand on that, I think you're able to hit more. So it's communicating that. Sometimes some people are like, dude, I don't need you to tell me, just give me a bonus or give me a Starbucks gift card or something, right? So it's playing the numbers. A wise entrepreneur does that to play the numbers of the psychology of the staff, that not everyone is temperament the same way. So when you expand on that, it's actually better.
Yeah. So now we did, we talked about resilience, the benefits of it, how to identify it, how to start working on it and improving your team. Now the $1 million question that an owner might ask, all right, put together this training program, or really been talking to the staff about this a lot over the last maybe 8 to 12 weeks. How do I know if it's actually working? Outside of just the eye test and being able to see or maybe hear things, how would I actually know, black and white paper numbers, that it's actually making a positive difference?
So there's a couple things. If you want to test whether a team is resilient, you got to put them in tough situations. That's a big one, right? If you want to test what your football team is made out of, we'll put them in a championship. Like get them to that spot. If it's a military operation, it's going to be a tough mission. So same with your business. And I think if you just want to see how training is going about, that's really easy. You could set up surveys, you could set up feedback, you do all kinds of stuff to, as that training is happening, you're able to hear from them directly through some kind of survey or whatever, see how they're feeling about it. But that's one thing. That's very theoretical. That's easy to do. Why don't you close 50 more giant accounts and see how your team handles that stress? If you're running a restaurant and you have this, grand reopening, and now you're flooded with people, you're going to see what people are made out of. So the purpose of the resilience is like, okay, it's to figure out whether your team can withstand the stressors of a growing business. If you're taking your company public, if you are expanding from one market to the next and you're opening up new offices, these are situations in your company where it's like, you're going to see what your team is made out of. And that what they're going to showcase to you is a lack of resilience or resilience 10 out of 10. So that's something you can't really fake. The other stuff, the feedback on surveys, sessions, having those one-on-ones, all that's great and that's cool. That'll help you determine whether the training that you're doing is being absorbed. Now let's see how it's applied. And that's up to the leader to make sure that you're putting your business in position to have those healthy stressors, to get out of that comfort zone, to grow the company.
Yeah. So I love all that because it's just very, at the end of the day, it's just how do they respond to situations? But for that person who's very analytical, it's like, that's fine and dandy. But before I maybe hire somebody and I spend maybe $25,000 on a training program to bring in some consultant because I don't know how to create a training program and they're going to do this for me. And I'm really focused on my ROI, right? That return on investment. So how would I know that if I'm getting my $25K back, what would I do then, right? And I look at that, and it's a pertinent question because if you're going to invest capital, you want to know, what do I get back for it? It's perfectly fine. But I know you talked at the beginning, and we discussed about productivity, looking at turnover rates, and that's one thing that a lot of companies don't really track. It's just what's your turnover rate, and like I don't know, is it good? Is it bad? I don't know that either.
Yeah.
All right. So you got to start by getting some data first because that does let you know, all right, do we, like you said, the numbers don't lie. And do we have a problem growing? If our turnover rate is 20% and industry average is 10%, why do you have such a big discrepancy there? So it's really just then being able to, outside of like putting them in stressful situations. And that is something that we've talked about burnout last episode that a lot of leaders don't want to do. It's like, I don't want to put them in a position that puts them under more stress. Then they never grow. It's like going to the gym. It's like, I'm going to just keep curling 30 pounds in each arm.
That's a great example.
It's like, all right, at what point do you try to do 35 pounds? Like, I don't do that, man, because then I'm really sore the next day. It's like, so what are we trying to do? Maintain, or are we trying to grow? So if you're worried about your team members, about putting them in a stressful spot, that's probably a good dead giveaway that they're maybe not the most resilient, number one. Yeah. But if you're trying to get them better, you got to stretch them a little. You got to put them under a little pressure to see how they actually respond. So to your point, hey, we've gone through this training. How do I know if it's working? Well, number one is put them into situations that they would get very stressed, or they'd get, they wouldn't respond the right way, or their normal self. That's number one. But then if you have that turnover rate that's elevated, all right, go back and reassess. Maybe not reassess in 6 weeks, but like, what's the turnover rate in the last quarter, the last 6 months? What's the productivity looking like? How engaged and motivated are their employees? Like, these are things you can measure outside of, to your point about getting feedback and filling out surveys. Are you measuring are you measuring the things that tell you what is actually going on in the day to day? Because then it does go back to the point of micromanaging. It's like, if I'm not on top of them all the time, how do I know what's going on? If you have the right data, that's how you know what's going on.
Very, very true. And this also kind of depends on the industry, but rehearsing is also really good. So depending on the type of business, we're here in Vegas. There's a lot of hotels where they'll do like a random rehearsal. Hey, we have, Beyonce and Jay-Z coming in and they're doing a party, and we have like literally 2 hours to flip everything around, and it's like all hands on deck. So rehearsing and drilling, or even doing like fake situations, right? Like, oh, this thing's coming in, just to see how people react. So that happens. There's some industries and there's some companies where it's like that may not be the best thing to do, but in some other cases, it actually is. It's like one of those fake drills you see in the Navy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm kind of like laughing as you're saying. I'm like, it's funny that we do like rehearsal dinners for weddings, And then you hire an employee, it's like, all right, just throw them right in. Like, yeah, no, don't rehearse anything, don't practice, don't train, just get right into it. They'll be fine. And then it's like, why is this person struggling? Duh, you didn't like prepare them accordingly. Yep. So yeah, I would say, look, at the end of the day, we talked a lot about what resiliency is, how to identify it, how to know if your team is, going in the right direction, how to hire the right people. Ultimately, I'm going to beat this to death. It's got to start with you guys as the owners, the entrepreneurs, the directors or managers. Like, it has to start with you first and foremost, is understanding how you respond. What's your mindset like? You can't ask something from a employee that you're not willing to either do yourself or you don't do yourself. Mm-hmm. And there's, like I'm telling you right now, that great communication, creating an environment that people can feel safe to come up with ideas and innovate, and also just making sure that our culture is on point and that we understand what are we actually working towards? What are the values that we're all sharing that's keeping us motivated in the times that may be tough?
Yep. I want to throw in a couple of really quick books on this because sometimes the stories of others is so impactful. Like you read a book like Shoe Dog from Phil Knight about Nike and the stuff that he went through. And it gives a lot of stories for entrepreneurs to have hope, to look at circumstances so they can avoid some pitfalls. There's another book called Man's Search for Meaning, which is a very, very powerful book that provides context on what is stress, what is tough, what is going through the ringer in life compared to other individuals at other times. We're like, okay, I thought I was going through it. I read this book, it puts things in perspective. And another one's probably called Chasing Daylight. And I recommend reading some books on resilience, on other people that have persevered, that have won, that have gone through the mud. I think this is really helpful with teams too, if you do like any type of book club where you kind of break it up, where it's not just about tactical things for your company, right? Specific programs, operations, but have a book that tells a story about man overcoming, women overcoming. And we are a storytelling species at the end of the day. Stuff like that really helps in workshopping and building a really great culture, is those types of stories.
Cool. Love it. Great advice. Then went out on that note. Can't end it any better. Other than if you guys just need some help, you have a company and you're struggling with resilience in your own team, or if you don't know if they're great at it, or you want to put together some workshops and not try to do it, hit us up in the episode description. You can book there's a link in there. You can book an appointment with us. Otherwise, we will catch you next time.
Bye, everybody.
Welcome to the follow-up, your little bonus-based episode just for your healthcare practitioners and organizations. So today we talked about resilience and how to develop it, how to build it, and how to also identify it. Now, we talked about some things in the episode that were very prevalent for healthcare. But first and foremost, I want you to start with being able to identify, how do I bring in new people to my organization that have resilience? And as I spoke to Antonio, this really is going to come down to you as your organization to come up with questions that are meant to help a person tell a story about situations in their life or in business that require them to be resilient, and to also hear how they responded. How did it make them feel? So first, I would say formulate appropriate, open-ended questions. And don't just ask them, have you ever had to be resilient? Yes. Okay, next question. So some really in-depth questions. This has been honestly the biggest game changer for me with regards to bringing in employees who are resilient. Night and day. Secondly, though, is making sure, do we have a common message that we're talking to the employees about? So if you're in a healthcare setting, you should be obviously treating patients. Does everybody in the organization feel that they have a part to play in this? Right? And I had mentioned this a few episodes back with regards to, it's very easy for a medical provider, somebody who's getting direct one-on-one attention with the patient, to know I have a purpose and I'm valued. But what about those ancillary positions in your company, like the front desk, right? They go very unnoticed and they're wondering, does my work really matter? So making sure that everybody is aligned with not just what we're trying to do here and understanding the company values, but do you actually value them? And do they know that they have a large part to play in getting a patient better. And then honestly, the third thing I would do is we talked about, Antonio called it rehearsals, I called it training, is making sure you're actually working with employees on the scenarios that cause the most stress, right? So if you have a clinic and your workflow for the day just happens to be see a lot of patients in the morning and your afternoon is kind of quiet, but then you get very busy after work. And I know certain areas, maybe like Vegas, gets a little bit busier at 3 o'clock. A lot of traditional places get busy around 5. And it's the same stress every single day. Are you working with those employees to handle what's going to happen if a patient shows up early, or we know patients show up late, right? So you have a clinic and a provider who now has a schedule that's built out. They're very regimented. And then Mr. Jones shows up 20 minutes early and your new patient shows up 20 minutes late. High stressful situation potentially. So how do you actually train them on what to do in those situations? And not just the provider. How do you train the whole staff, in terms of people that are going to be interacting with those patients? All right, just like I said, the 3 things that I want you guys to really work on, just to do a little recap, would be bringing in employees who are resilient and doing this by developing really great open-ended questions for your interview process so you know this person has a resiliency and is going to be a huge asset. The second aspect is going to be, what are the values of the company? Like, what are you actually working towards? Obviously, like I said, it should be about getting patients better, but every office has a little bit of a different message. Do the employees know what that message is? And then working on training or rehearsing in those difficult situations. Hope this was helpful for you. I know they've been massively impactful for me. I'll see you guys in the next episode.